The Museum Roadshow is brought to you by 125 Apparel.
Hi, I'm Kathy Coyle, volunteer with the Becker County Museum. We've got a lot of interesting things going on because it's not just happening within the walls of that old museum that hopefully is going to be replaced within a year, but also outreach. And that's why I'm standing in a cemetery today, because you're going to see a fascinating display of outreach. Some of the pioneers and some of the people that you might have known are buried here, and you're going to find out their stories. But you know, besides the cemetery crawls that we've had in 4 locations now, we also have museum sponsored walks downtown, so you learn about the history of the downtown. A lot of stories down there, let's say. We've got workshops that go on for young children, whether it's in the summer or the Christmas vacation time. Those are really hot. They've got robotics and coding. I can't believe it. I didn't even know what coding was, and this little girl, as soon as I said the word coding, her eyes just lit up. And that's the future. The important thing is that that's where the jobs are going to be. They're already there. And the manufacturers here in Detroit Lake said, please train more kids. And robotics, that's something that the manufacturers want young people who are going to be young adults applying for jobs within, not too long from now. They want them trained in robotics. So that's something that the museum is really proud of. Got a lot of good things going on. We've got those noon speakers where you come in, bring your lunch if you want. If you want to pinch your pennies like I do, or you can plan ahead and get a nice lunch from La Barista. A lot of good things going on at the Becker County Museum. And we have a capital campaign going on. And I'd love to tell you more about it. I'd love to sit at your kitchen table and tell you about it, how you can play a part in it. You can draw out your pledge to 5 years if you want. I decided to do that to make it more affordable for me, because I want to support all these fun things that are going on, and important historical things and science-related things. STEAM. Science, technology, engineering, arts, and mechanics. We've got it covered at the Becker County Museum. But now I want to introduce you to some of the wonderful people that are here, their final resting place here at Holy Rosary Cemetery. You're going to meet Clem from Clem's Dock. Remember him with his megaphone? You're going to meet a man who is just enamored with baseball, but a sad ending coming back from the World Series. You're going to meet a pioneer woman who didn't even have a first name. But thanks to Mary Haney, we found out the first name of Mrs. Nooner. And then we've got a beloved piano teacher, as well as the character that I take on, Mary Burgeon. So I hope you'll join us as we take you through a number of weeks here at the Holy Rosary Cemetery.
Good afternoon. Welcome to Holy Rosary Cemetery. I am Mrs. George Nooner. Now, history doesn't record much about me. It doesn't even give me a name in the Alvin Wilcox book, A History of Becker County. There is a picture of my husband and I, George, in there, as we were among the very earliest settlers of Erie Township. We came to this area in March of 1873. Now that's very early. We were among the very earliest European settlers in this part of the country. We came from Buffalo, New York, and we came across the Great Lakes on a steamship to Duluth. And believe me, Duluth was not much of a town back then. I think you could have bought the whole thing for about $50. Anyway, we took the train from Duluth down to St. Paul, and then we took the train from St. Paul up here to what was then known as Tylertown. There were only 2 or 3 buildings at this point, and it was, the only settlement was where the railroad crossed the Pelican River by what I think you would now call lake shirts, I think it's called. Anyway, that's all there was. There really weren't any roads. There had been a few settlers just before that, no families. So when George and I came, we brought our family, our 2 sons, John and Frank, who were fortunately at that time teenagers. George and I were both born in Germany, and we emigrated to the United States, and we settled for a while in Buffalo, New York. And then we heard about this project to start a colony in Becker County called the Buffalo Colony, which all meant we came from Buffalo, New York. Most of us were Catholic. We're almost all of German heritage. And so George and I signed up. George was a joiner or a furniture maker, cabinet maker. He was handy with his hands and good with making things. So we decided to become pioneers and come to Becker County. And when we got here, there wasn't much here. Fortunately for us, and unfortunately for our predecessor, there was a small cabin already built in the southwest corner of Erie Township. Now this was what you would now call Detroit Mountain. We were west of that, between the town of what became Detroit. We were east of Detroit and west of the mountain in that area. And there wasn't much there except a lot of swamp or wetlands. It was wetlands and woods, and that was about it. But we had a small area cleared and a cabin because this other gentleman had started a homestead and he left the area and died. And so we took over his cabin and his homestead claim. So we had a little something to start with, which was good. But at the time, the trails were so bad that people were often injured in their buggies or their wagons trying to get from town out to where they were living because the roads were so terrible. They'd hit a rut and they'd go flying out of their wagon. It was pretty awful. So conditions were rough when we got here. And unfortunately, poor old George died a year after we got here in 1874, leaving me, a widow woman, with 2 kids who were, fortunately, they were teenagers. But it was a very tough place to make a living and to even stay alive for a woman. And I wasn't exactly young. I was almost 50 years old. So I actually didn't stay a widow very long. And an interesting fact, even though my son Frank put up this lovely monument, and Frank is buried here, and here's a monument to George Nooner, 1821 to 1874, but George isn't actually buried here. When he died, he was in our homestead in Erie Township, and he died and was buried out there. He died about 10 years before this became a cemetery, so he's not here. And guess what? I'm not here either. After George died, a couple of years later, I remarried, and my new husband wanted to leave the area. So we emigrated to the state of Oregon, and we settled in a farming community between Eugene, Oregon, and Portland. And that's where I died in 1914. So I'm not buried here. George isn't buried here. But we were among the first Catholics in this area and among the first parishioners of Holy Rosary. And some years later, my dear darling son Frank put up this monument, and there's Frank, and he included his father, but he didn't include me. So far, I haven't given you my first name. The Wilcox history doesn't give me a first name. I'm just listed as Mrs. George Nooner, but my first name is Elizabeth. So I'm Mrs. Elizabeth Nooner, and I'm not here, but I'm glad you came to see me today.
Thank you for watching this episode of the Museum Roadshow, brought to you by 125 Apparel.